Imagine standing on a battlefield, watching 10,000 soldiers advance toward you in perfect, unbroken formation. One of your arrows finds its mark. A warrior falls. And then, as if the earth itself has swallowed the wound, another soldier steps seamlessly into the gap, the line never faltering, never thinning. The army looks exactly as it did before, as if no one had died at all, as if these men simply could not be killed. That was the effect the Persian Immortals were designed to create. And for 2 centuries, it worked. Welcome back. Today we're going deep into one of the most legendary military units in all of ancient history, the 10,000 elite soldiers who formed the iron core of the Achaemenid Persian Empire. They were called the Athenatoi, the Immortals, and what we know about them is far more extraordinary and far stranger than most history books let on. Let's start at the very beginning, because the first thing you need to understand about the Immortals is that the name itself was a piece of military theater, one of the most sophisticated pieces of psychological warfare the ancient world had ever seen. The Greek historian Herodotus, our primary source for much of what we know about the Persian Wars, tells us that this force was called the Immortals because whenever a man was killed or fell sick, he was immediately replaced so that the unit's number never dropped below 10,000. To an enemy watching from across the field, the army never shrank, never seemed to suffer losses. It was as if the warriors genuinely could not die. Whether the Persians themselves coined the name, or whether the Greeks applied it in stunned observation, we cannot say for certain. But the psychological impact was real and deliberate. 10,000 was not an arbitrary number. In ancient Near Eastern and Persian military tradition, numbers carried meaning. 10,000 was a unit of completion, of totality. The Immortals were meant to represent the full strength of the empire made flesh, not a regiment within an army, but the living symbol of Persian power itself. The Achaemenid Empire at its height stretched from the Aegean Sea in the west to the Indus Valley in the east, from the shores of Egypt to the steppes of Central Asia. It was the largest empire the world had yet seen, a civilization of staggering complexity, governing dozens of peoples, languages, and religions under a single dynasty. At the center of that dynasty sat the King of Kings, the Shahanshah, and at the center of his military power stood the Immortals. They were divided into 2 groups, and this division tells us a great deal about how Persian royalty was organized and protected. The first 10,000, the outer ring, so to speak, were the regular Immortals, the heavy infantry who formed the spine of the Persian army in open battle. But within that 10,000, an inner regiment of 1,000 men served as the king's personal bodyguard. These were the most elite of the elite, men drawn exclusively from Persian and Median nobility, warriors who never left the king's side in battle or in peace. They were distinguished by pomegranate-shaped golden ornaments on the butts of their spears rather than the silver pomegranates carried by the outer regiment. This small difference in decoration was a mark of extraordinary privilege. It meant you ate with the king. It meant you died with the king if it came to that. The equipment of the Immortals was something remarkable to behold, and here archaeology and ancient art have given us a tremendous gift. On the walls of Persepolis, the great ceremonial capital built by Darius the Great and expanded by Xerxes, there are vast relief carvings of the Immortals in procession, and they are extraordinarily detailed. These reliefs show soldiers in colorful robes or scale armor, carrying long spears with those distinctive pomegranate counterweights, composite bows slung over their shoulders, and a short sword, the Achaemenid, at their hips. They wore elaborate headdresses, sometimes depicted as soft fabric hoods or ornate crowns, and their clothing is richly patterned, a visual reminder that these were not anonymous foot soldiers, but men of status serving an empire of immense aesthetic sophistication. The composite bow was perhaps their most lethal weapon. Built from layers of wood, horn, and sinew glued together under tremendous pressure, the Persian composite bow could punch through armor at ranges that simple wooden bows could not achieve. Every Immortal was expected to be deadly from a distance and dangerous up close. They were not one-dimensional warriors. They were trained killers in multiple registers of violence. Their wicker shields, called spara, were large and curved, designed to be planted in the ground to create a temporary wall of cover from which archers could fire. In a large formation, rows of Immortals would advance behind these shield walls, loosing arrows at the enemy from relative safety before closing the distance for hand-to-hand combat. It was a sophisticated system, and when it worked, it was devastating. But the Immortals were more than just soldiers. They were an institution. And understanding that institution requires understanding the empire that created it. The Achaemenid dynasty was founded by Cyrus the Great in the mid-6th century BC, and one of Cyrus's defining innovations was the idea of a multi-ethnic empire governed by a philosophy of tolerance, at least by ancient standards. The Immortals reflected this philosophy in fascinating ways. While the core of the regiment was always Persian and Median, over time men from other peoples of the empire could rise into its ranks. The army of a multicultural empire needed to project the image of that empire, and the Immortals, marching in their thousands at the head of the Persian host, were that projection. Their training began early. Persian aristocratic boys were educated from the age of 5 in 3 arts above all others: to ride a horse, to shoot a bow, and to speak the truth. That last one might seem out of place in a list of martial skills, but in the Zoroastrian religion that underpinned Persian court culture, truth, Asha, was the foundational virtue. A warrior who lied was a warrior whose soul was compromised. The Immortals were not just trained to kill. They were trained to be, in the Persian moral imagination, good men. What that meant in practice on a battlefield is a more complicated question, but the ideology mattered. It shaped how they understood themselves. When we talk about the Immortals in popular culture, we inevitably have to address the movies. The 2006 film 300 depicted the Immortals as monstrous, masked figures with clawed hands and grotesque faces, fantasy warriors ripped from the visual vocabulary of horror. It was spectacular cinema and catastrophically bad history. The real Immortals were not mysterious demons. They were professional soldiers of extraordinary discipline, dressed in the fashionable colors of the Persian court, armed with practical weapons, and organized with a sophistication that was the product of generations of military evolution. They were more terrifying for being human, because it meant that the organizational genius behind them was human too. The masks that appear in ancient Persian art were not battle masks of the kind 300 imagined. Persians at Persepolis are depicted with their faces fully visible. Some scholars have pointed to certain archaeological finds of bronze face coverings as possible ceremonial items, but there is no evidence the Immortals wore masks as a standard feature of battle. The legend grew from the mystery, not from the reality. What we know about them in actual battle is both illuminating and humbling. The Immortals fought in some of the most consequential engagements in ancient history, and their record is not one of pure invincibility. At the Battle of Thermopylae in 480 BC, perhaps the most famous engagement of the Greco-Persian Wars, the Immortals faced the Spartan-led Greek force holding the narrow coastal pass. The first day of fighting was disastrous for the Persians. The narrow pass negated their numerical advantage, and the Greek phalanx, an interlocking wall of bronze and muscle, proved brutally effective in the confined space. Wave after wave of Persian infantry was sent forward and repulsed. When Xerxes finally unleashed the Immortals, expecting them to shatter the Greek line with their prestige and skill, the results were the same. The Spartans and their allies held. The Immortals, for all their legend, could not force the pass by direct assault. This is not a failure we should dismiss or explain away. It is historically important. It tells us that the Immortals were not magically superior to all other forces. They were elite, yes. They were superbly equipped and trained. But they were infantry fighting in terrain that stripped away the advantages of Persian tactical doctrine. The Greek victory at Thermopylae, even in defeat, since the Greeks ultimately were outflanked, demonstrated that the Immortals were formidable but not invincible. They were men, not myths. An understanding that actually makes them more interesting, not less. Thermopylae was ultimately won for the Persians not by the Immortals in frontal assault, but by treachery. A Greek named Ephialtes showed a Persian flanking force the mountain path that allowed them to surround the defenders. And it was the Immortals, or at least a large division of them, who made that flanking march through the mountains overnight. Herodotus describes the march in detail. The Persian force moving quietly through the dark, olive leaves crunching underfoot, arriving at the ridge above the Greek position just as dawn broke. It was not a moment of monstrous terror, but of disciplined military execution. A night march over difficult mountain terrain requires extraordinary organization. The Immortals delivered it. At the subsequent Battle of Plataea in 479 BC, Persian forces led by the general Mardonius engaged a massive Greek alliance on open ground. The Immortals formed part of the Persian center, and in the brutal, chaotic fighting that day, the Persian army was ultimately defeated, not because the Immortals failed specifically, but because the combined Greek force, including Spartans and Athenians fighting in unison, proved too resilient. Mardonius was killed, the Persian camp was sacked, and the invasion of Greece was effectively ended. The Immortals survived to fight another day, retreating with the remnants of the Persian force back to Asia. Beyond the Greek wars, the Immortals served as the sword arm of Persian expansion and suppression across an enormous geographical range. They participated in the conquest of Egypt, in campaigns against the Scythians of the Black Sea steppe, in the long grinding wars to maintain control of Babylon and the wealthy satrapies of Anatolia. They were the instrument by which the largest empire on earth maintained itself. One of the most remarkable things about their service is what it required logistically. An army moving with 10,000 elite soldiers needed to supply not just food and water, but the materials to maintain their complex equipment. Composite bows needed humidity-controlled storage to prevent delamination. Scale armor required constant repair. Horses for the officers needed fodder. Persian military logistics were, for the ancient world, astonishing. There are records from Persepolis and from administrative centers throughout the empire of elaborate supply chains, of rations calculated per man per day, of dedicated personnel tracking equipment and replacements. The Immortals did not just appear on battlefields. They were sustained there by an administrative infrastructure that is still underappreciated in most popular accounts of Persian history. The relationship between the Immortals and the Persian king was personal in a way that is hard to fully appreciate from a modern vantage point. The inner regiment of 1,000 men lived alongside the king. They marched in his processions. They guarded his tent at night. They were present at royal ceremonies, standing in splendid formation as foreign ambassadors arrived at court. They were a visible expression of royal power in every dimension: military, ceremonial, administrative. To threaten the king was to threaten them, and to be one of them was to be, in Persian terms, one of the most honored men in the world. Persian kings were not distant figures behind palace walls. They were expected to lead campaigns in person, and this meant the bodyguard regiment of Immortals was genuinely in danger when the king went to war. At Thermopylae, Xerxes watched the fighting from a golden throne on a hillside above the battlefield, and his Immortals were fighting and dying below. The relationship between protector and protected was real and tested under fire. What happened to the Immortals when Alexander the Great dismantled the Achaemenid Empire in the 330s and 320s BC? This is one of the more poignant threads in the story. When Alexander defeated Darius III at the Battle of Gaugamela in 331 BC, the final destruction of Achaemenid power was underway. Persepolis was sacked and burned, one of the great acts of cultural destruction in ancient history. The administrative apparatus that sustained the Immortals was dissolved. The dynasty that had called them into being ceased to exist. But soldiers do not simply vanish. Many Persian nobles and their warriors continued to resist Alexander for years in the mountain fastnesses of eastern Iran and Central Asia. Some were absorbed into Alexander's own forces. The conqueror famously incorporated Persian noble cavalry and infantry into his army, recognizing their quality. Alexander himself adopted elements of Persian court ceremony, to the horror of his Macedonian companions, and it is entirely possible that some of the Persian guardsmen who surrounded him in his later years were themselves descended from the Immortal tradition. The name itself passed into history, and then into legend, and then into the permanent vocabulary of military excellence. The Ottoman Empire would later create elite units explicitly modeled on the Persian example. The Imperial Iranian Army in the 20th century revived the name for its own bodyguard units. In our own era, the Immortals live on in movies, in novels, in games, in every retelling of Thermopylae. Their legacy as the gold standard of ancient military excellence, so thoroughly embedded in Western and Eastern cultural memory that it is nearly impossible to discuss elite military units without at least a passing thought of what they represented. And what they represented when you strip away the legend, is something deeply human. They represented the idea that an institution, rigorously maintained, ideologically grounded, logistically supported, and constantly renewed, could achieve something that any individual soldier could not. Immortality, in the Persian imagination, was not about any one man. It was about the unit. When a warrior fell, the institution went on. The line never broke. The number never fell below 10,000. In a world before the nation-state, before standing armies in the modern sense, before military professionalism as a formally theorized concept, the Persians had intuited something that would take military theorists another 2,000 years to articulate clearly, that the morale and the structure of an army are as important as its physical strength. The Immortals were terrifying not primarily because each individual soldier was exceptional, though they were, but because the unit itself seemed to transcend individual mortality. You could kill a man in the ranks and nothing would change. The machine would absorb your victory and keep moving. That is the real story of the Immortals. Not monsters in masks, not fictional demons, but soldiers, real, breathing, mortal human beings, organized into something that functioned, from the outside, like a force of nature. If this story has gripped you the way it grips me every time I dive back into it, I want you to do something. Take 30 seconds right now and hit that subscribe button, because this channel exists to tell exactly these stories. The ones where history is stranger and richer and more fascinating than any movie has ever managed to capture. And if you like this video, that like button genuinely helps more people find us, which means more of these deep dives into the moments and the warriors and the civilizations that built the world we live in. And if you want to keep going right now, because I know some of you are already hungry for the next piece of this world, there's a video waiting for you on the Battle of Thermopylae itself, where we go into the full account of those 3 days in the past, the Spartans, the politics, and the aftermath that most films completely ignore. It's right there. I'll see you in it.